Have you ever just looked around at the world and felt a sense of déjà vu? You see it in politics, in business, pretty much everywhere. We all say we want change, right? We talk about needing fresh ideas, real innovation, and yet, time after time, we seem to choose something else. We choose the familiar over the brilliant. So the big question is, why?
It's a pattern that's pretty hard to miss once you start looking for it. We complain, we voice our frustrations about a total lack of vision, or about decisions that just seem to ignore really obvious problems. But then, when it's time to choose, somehow the comfortable, the predictable, even the person who seems, not that capable, ends up right back in charge. It can feel like we're all stuck in some kind of loop, complaining about the results of a choice that we, collectively, keep on making.
Our first instinct is always to blame the system. We say it's broken, it's corrupt, it's failing us. But here's a much more challenging thought. What if the system isn't broken at all? What if it's actually working perfectly and it's producing the exact outcome it was designed for? Now that's an unsettling idea, but it's the one we're going to unpack today.
To really get why this happens, we need to look deeper. We got to go past the day-to-day politics and look right into our own human nature. And that brings us to the first big piece of this puzzle. It's a powerful and often invisible social instinct.
So what is this incredibly powerful instinct? Well, it's a deep collective craving for one thing: stability. Yep, more than genius, more than peak performance, more than game-changing innovation, we are just hardwired to seek safety. We want to know that tomorrow is going to look a whole lot like today. It's this fundamental desire for a world that feels predictable, not one that feels like it's constantly on the edge of chaos.
And this is ancient wisdom we're talking about. Over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle pointed out that any political system is basically a mirror. It just reflects the character of the people living in it. So if a society as a whole values comfort over courage or chooses emotion over hard evidence, then its leaders are going to end up embodying those exact same traits. So in that sense, our leaders aren't really accidents. They're reflections of us.
Okay, so this fundamental need for stability, it creates this constant tension, right? A trade-off that every single society has to navigate, whether we realize we're doing it or not. And it really is the core conflict between two things: safety and brilliance.
A really good way to think about this is to imagine society as a living body. For just day-to-day survival, what do we rely on? The heart. It keeps a steady, predictable rhythm. It makes sure everything is stable. That's your familiar leader. But to evolve, to solve the really tough problems, we need the brain. The brain is the innovator, the visionary. The brain is what sees the flaws in the system and says, hey, we need to change direction. And for a body that's gotten really comfortable with its current rhythm, that kind of signal can feel, pretty dangerous.
So the natural consequence of all this is that our systems become incredibly good at filtering out the brain type of leaders, the innovator, the reformer, the person who tells the hard truths. Their very existence challenges our collective comfort zone, so they get sidelined a lot. Because the system, by default, it isn't really designed to reward brilliance. It's designed to reward what's acceptable.
So how does this preference for the familiar just get so locked in? Well, it's because the system itself develops a really powerful defense mechanism, and it's all designed to just keep things as they are.
It all works like a powerful feedback loop. Let's just walk through it. First, the public wants safety and predictability. So this needs them to choose familiar, non-threatening leaders. That's the heart. Then, those leaders in turn build and reinforce institutions, the bureaucracies, the laws, the cultural norms that are all designed to resist and slow down any major change. And this creates an environment where innovators and challengers are just naturally rejected. They aren't seen as saviors, they're seen as threats to the system's stability. And this rejection just reinforces the public's belief that safety is the most important thing, starting the whole cycle all over again.
And this brings us to a really powerful new way of looking at a word we normally use as an insult: mediocrity. From this perspective, mediocrity in leadership isn't an accident. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature. It's kind of like the system's own immune response, protecting the social body from the shock and the discomfort of radical change.
But this cycle isn't unbreakable. History shows us there are moments when this entire dynamic just gets completely shattered, and that usually happens for one big reason. A crisis gets so bad that the old way of doing things just isn't an option anymore. This is the tipping point. This is the moment when the collective pain of the present, whether it's from economic collapse or deep social division or even war, finally becomes greater than the collective fear of the unknown. And all of a sudden, the familiar doesn't feel safe anymore. It feels like failure.
And in that moment of clarity, what people want fundamentally shifts.
Just think about Singapore back in the 1960s. They were facing just immense poverty, total division. Their very survival was on the line. The luxury of choosing the familiar was gone. The demand was for pure competence, for results, and that demand brought forth a leader like Lee Kuan Yew. Or look at South Africa in the 1990s, coming out of the deep trauma of apartheid. The nation wasn't looking for just another comforting politician. It was desperate for a moral compass, for someone with the incredible wisdom to heal a fractured country. And it found that in Nelson Mandela.
In these moments of crisis, a society's priorities achieve this profound clarity. The steady rhythm of the heart just wasn't enough anymore. The demand shifted. It wasn't about comfort. It was about survival. It was about progress, and it was about healing. And for that, you don't need the familiar. You need the exceptional brain.
So this raises a really critical question. If crisis is the only thing that breaks the cycle, are we just doomed to repeat it until disaster strikes? Well, not necessarily. And this brings us to the final and maybe the most important piece of the whole puzzle. Can a society choose to evolve before it's forced to?
And the answer? Well, it brings us full circle, right back to Aristotle's mirror. If we want better leaders, the change has to start with the reflection. In a way, the public is the marketplace, and the quality of leadership a society gets is a direct result of what that marketplace is demanding.
This evolution doesn't just happen by accident. It happens through deliberate cultural shifts. It starts in our schools when we teach our kids how to think critically, not just what to memorize. It continues in our media when we as the consumers start to reward honest, substantive discussion over sensational drama. And most importantly, it happens inside of us as citizens, when we actually build the discipline to value evidence over raw emotion and find the collective courage to face uncomfortable truths instead of just retreating into comforting lies.
And when you look at it that way, it just turns the whole problem on its head. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, we've been asking the wrong question all along. The focus shifts from complaining about our leaders to taking a hard look at ourselves. So the most important question isn't, why are they in power? It's a much harder question. When are we going to be ready?
Because ultimately, that's the goal for any society, isn't it? To mature. To get to a point where brilliance is no longer seen as some kind of threat to our comfort, but as an absolute necessity for our survival. A point where we don't just tolerate challenging ideas, we actively seek them out. That is the moment a society truly evolves, moving beyond the safety of the familiar and stepping toward greatness.